It's really amazing how cheap planar magnetic headphones are getting, and this, the FiiO JT-7, is a prime example of that. But there might be a reason you wouldn't want to get it. Let's talk about it. I bought these headphones a few weeks ago for about $119 on Amazon. And it's really crazy seeing a planar this cheap these days. We're gonna go over the build quality, I'm gonna talk about the sound, and then we'll talk about frequency response and measurements. That's a part you're not gonna wanna miss. You get my scale. Last time I used these, I said, these are what I use to weigh my coffee beans on, and someone said, that's the most millennial comment ever. Look, bud, I can't help it, I like good coffee. These come in at 328 grams. Honestly, that's pretty great for a planar. Even a lot of flagship planars end up weighing a ton. And if you don't know what that word I keep saying is planar, well, it's this. The entire headphone is a speaker. Look at that, I can shine my light right through the whole thing. This entire film acts as an electromagnet and repels against these magnetic bars inside the chassis. There's benefits to that, like it having very low acoustic resistance or a very large surface area that it can use to produce low frequencies like bass. This means that planars usually have pretty good extension into the sub bass. The downsides are usually weight and wonky things in the timbre, which is really short and oversimplified how natural something sounds. The build of these is pretty decent, especially at its price point. They tilt, they swivel, something again we don't see on some flagships. They have a pretty good amount of adjustments. The headband looks very heavily inspired by the Sennheiser HD490 Pro with a divot right in the middle. Beautiful, chef's kiss. Ample padding on either side, and while these are not the most comfortable thing I've ever tried, they're pretty far up there. They're decent. If the HD600 has too much clamp for you, but you like everything else about them, this will probably be right up your alley in terms of comfort. But if you are sensitive to top pressure, you might have a little bit of a problem with these because they sit a little bit more on the top than they do clamp on the sides. That said, they are not a wild offender of any of these things, and overall I feel like the pressure and weight is pretty evenly distributed. They come with a pretty standard dual entry 3.5mm connector here and 3.5 on the other end that you could plug up with a 6.3mm adapter. They do also come with a 4.4mm balance cable, but these are so easy to power, you do not need that. And as a prime example, this is a MacBook from a few years old. You can plug it up to that, and about 3/4 volume is certainly listening level. You might be a person who wants to listen louder than that, but I would also encourage you to protect your hearing. If you need a desktop amp to get more volume out of them, you can. But I don't personally believe they need it as long as you're listening within safe levels. Let's talk about sound. What is that listening experience like? Well, honestly, decent. They have some problems, but let's go through from the bottom to the top. Sub bass is solid. These are not going to be elevated sub bass like crazy, like you'll get with a closed back Bluetooth headphone, but it is plenty of deep, extended, healthy sub bass. It's not rolling off super hard. You have solid bass right above that that goes through a very linear low and central mid-range. Above that, we have a bit of a dip in that sort of 2K region that's really common with a lot of planars, especially with things from like Hyphaman, like the Aria, Sandara, Edition XS, and so on. And then things get messy. Around like 3 kilohertz and up, these turn into a bit of a roller coaster with some shout, with some peaks. General unpleasantness that Resolve will describe as scrungly. He's gonna use the word scrungly. If he used the word scrungly when his video comes out, leave it in a comment down below. If you don't know who I'm talking about the headphone show. Those guys are friends, don't worry. But I would agree with that take. These are scrungly through sort of the mid treble and upper treble. And that scrungly shoutiness, it's not super pleasant. It's not sibilant like a Beyerdynamic, but it's also not smooth like a Sennheiser. We're sitting in a weird mid territory where parts of the treble on this are very pleasing and parts of the treble are just not fun. Now, this isn't the end of the world. We're gonna talk more about that in frequency response and ways you might be able to fix it. Let's talk about some other sound characteristics first. As I said, timbre, kind of how natural things sound, suffers a little bit on these. It's just not as natural sounding as a dynamic driver, but they are very lively. They're very fast. Like mini planars, they're very articulated and very quick sounding. I especially like the sound of bass guitar on these. Anything related to that I think sounds really good. They're somewhat closed in, not super wide. So recently I've been talking about vintage AKGs like the K612, the K712, the K702, those things. All of those headphones have way more soundstage than this. This is like 6xx soundstage plus just a little bit more. So don't expect these to sound wide and crazy. Though they do image pretty good. That's sort of how well they are at placing things in the space around you. Would I use these for gaming? Maybe, probably not. You could, and I wouldn't give you crap for it. They'd be fine for that, but having a wall of other things at my disposal, this would never be my first choice. Now let's talk about frequency response, and then I want to talk about the conclusion of these because it still might surprise you. Pulling up the graphs on my laptop. Here is the frequency response and HPTF variation for this headphone. Now this isn't the variation of how it's placed on the rig, this is the variation across multiple different types of rigs, all compensated to the diffuse field head related transfer functions. What the hell does that mean? It means this is a map of how this headphone will likely respond when it's on your head. You will fit somewhere within this range, so you might hear a peak, or you might not. As you can see, bass is pretty strong. We have good sub bass, it doesn't roll off until pretty dang low. We're fitting on the lower end of the average listener preference bounds for slightly elevated bass, which is nice. We have a good bit of linearity into the mid-range, and it does get a bit warm there in the low mids. That makes it sound a little bit bloated. Not a ton, but just a little bit bloated, but more so compared to the recess we have between 1 kilohertz and 2 kilohertz. That scoop, I think, is hurting this headphone more than anything, and if that area was a bit more filled in, it would help a lot. The other big fault is directly above that. So right here between 3 and 4 kilohertz, we have this mountain. It looks a lot like Mount Baker here in Washington. If I go out my door, walk down the street a little bit, and turn around on a sunny day, I'll see Mount Baker. And I tell you, it looks exactly like that. Now, again, you might be on the lower end of that mountain. And if you are, it's gonna sound a lot better. But if you're on the higher end of that mountain, it is a shout fest. 3 to 4 kilohertz is the area that we are most sensitive to in our hearing, and while I don't mind a bit of elevation at 3 kilohertz, 4 kilohertz is not my favorite. Above that, the treble is pretty erratic, but for the most part, elevated relatively consistently. So it's going to be a little bit brighter up on top, but that is entirely overshadowed by the mountain of 4 kilohertz, the great mountain of 4 kilohertz. You can pad swap these, and it actually helps us quite a bit. The first pad that I threw on these was the Dakoni T50 velour pads, and look what it did. It didn't completely fix the headphone, but it did even out that range a bit more. It brought the entirety of the region between 2 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz down by anywhere from 4 to 5 decibels in some places. And you might still experience that peak, but it would be significantly less so. Now, the rest of that treble is still elevated above that, which means this thing is gonna sound kind of sparkly regardless. And there are other pads that can bring that down, but this, I feel like, worked out pretty well. And that sparkly treble does balance out pretty well with the bass. Now, again, it's not perfect, but it is an improvement, and at the price for a planar, that's not bad. One more thing I want to show you in the measurements though that isn't great is the left-right channel balance I have on this unit. This is the delta between the left and the right channel. And as you can see, it's not a crazy channel imbalance, but we have a bit more of it in the low frequencies, and that's actually more of where we hear it. There are spots in the treble where we encroach upon a 5 decibel difference for little bits of peaks and stuff. I don't really hear it nearly as much up there, mostly I think because these vary a lot based on position on the head. So you're gonna have lots of weird peaks and dips in the treble no matter what. And your brain kind of tunes those out, but that little bit of a difference, that like 1.5 decibel difference in the bass, that I started to notice. So conclusion time. FiiO JT-7, should you buy these and do I recommend them? Well, the answer is maybe. I know that's a shitty answer, but it boils down to this. This is actually a pretty good price for a planar headphone. This is a pretty well-rounded planar headphone. They're reasonably light, they're pretty comfortable, decent ergonomics all around, decent but not crazy soundstage, still pretty narrow, but open back, low acoustic resistance, low variation, all things considered. I mean, they still have variation, but it's relatively low for what they are. And a very good candidate for pad rolling to fix things like irregularities in the upper mid-range and in the treble. This is a budget headphone, but it is a budget headphone that does its job pretty well. If you're willing to accept the downsides that this headphone has, then yes, I do recommend it. Enough so that I'm going to make a video for my float plane and Patreon where I'm pad rolling this thing with a bunch of different pads. If I can find some pads that are good, I will include them, in that video. If you want to check that out, get early access to other videos, plus things like EQ profiles and some other projects, you can check out my float plane and Patreon, the link in the video description. That's how this channel makes money. Other than that, that is my review of the FiiO JT-7. You know the drill about like and subscribe. Remember, good audio is getting cheap audio is getting good. Price doesn't correlate with sound quality, and vote with your wallet. Catch you guys in the next one. Peace.